Again, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Sommer Schneider. I'm an associate director and professor for the Center for Jewish Civilization, and this is my pleasure to introduce our fourth panel of the conference, titled Women, White Power Movements, and the Holocaust. I'm afraid this panel won't be as entertaining as the previous one. We are not going to present much music nor sing in this panel, but I really hope that this panel will be equally interesting and engaging. Before we get started, I will also remind everyone about Georgetown's free speech and expression policy, which I believe it doesn't appear on board as it should.
It's okay.
Now please let me introduce our two panelists, and I will start. Actually, I will reintroduce Professor Wendy Lauer, who we already had a chance to hear from her earlier today. Professor Wendy Lauer is the John Roth Professor of History and Director of the Mgrublian Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna College. Who says that English is an easy language? Although my son, 4-year-old son, would argue that Polish is a lot more difficult to learn. Her research and teaching focuses on a history of genocide and Holocaust and human rights. Lauer is the author of Hitler's Furious, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and has been translated into 23 languages. She wrote Nazi Empire, Building and a Holocaust in Ukraine, and edited the diary of Samuel Goldfarb and the Holocaust in Galicia. She served as the acting director of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mendel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in the years between 2016 and 2018. Prior to that, she taught at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, Germany, from 2007 to 2012, where she was a German Research Foundation grant recipient. And our next speaker is Seyward Darby, who serves as the editor-in-chief of the Atavist magazine. She formerly held positions at other esteemed news sources as deputy editor of foreign policy and online editor of the New Republic. In September 2017, her article on women in the alt-right movement, Rise of the Valkyries, was chosen as the cover story for Harper's Magazine. Her scholarship on the topic has been spotlighted by National Public Radio. Currently, Darby is writing a book about women and white nationalism in America. Her research is focused on social justice and culture. And Seyward, would you be so kind, please, to tell us maybe a little bit more about your research and also upcoming book?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm not an academic, and it's really great to be sitting next to Wendy because her book was an inspiration for the research I'm doing, and so it's a little surreal. But anyway, so I think what I do is a little different than what a lot of panelists who've already spoken do. My research is very much in progress. And the genesis of it began, the genesis of it was, sorry, I need more coffee apparently. The genesis of it was essentially Trump's election. I was here in DC at the time. I was still working at foreign policy and was upset, as many of us were. And 2 weeks after that, I was actually down in the Shenandoah Valley. My family is from the South. They've been there for hundreds of years. They fought for the Confederacy. My great-grandfather actually fought the minimum wage all the way up to the Supreme Court, where he lost. He did not think he should have to pay his black workers as much as other workers if he didn't want to. And so, I come from this place where, I was very well aware of some of the nasty undercurrents in American politics and culture. And when I was in the Shenandoah, my husband and I stopped at a gas station, and I saw a woman commit a hate crime. A white woman yelled at a black woman, called her the N-word, was very hostile. And it all had to do with the fact that the black woman was blocking a gas tank with her car. And the white woman wanted her to move, but rather than ask her to move, she started yelling racial epithets at her. And, at the exact same time, we're hearing about Richard Spencer giving the Nazi salute at the conference here in DC. We're hearing all about these angry white men. And it really, the genesis was a simple question: where are the women? Because I was sure they were out there. And as I said in my Harper's piece, no social movement can survive on men alone. And so I started looking. And I've spent, and I still spend, a lot of time in very weird corners of the internet. Stormfront, definitely, but also, Twitter, Gab, 4chan, 8chan, Facebook, their YouTube, which I think is arguably the most toxic of all social networks out there for this issue. And I've also met women in person. And the Harper's article was a sort of manifestation of all of the research I had done up to that point over about 10 months. And it profiled several women who are extremely vocal in white nationalism today. One of them, actually, she and her husband run a YouTube channel that live streamed the hearing yesterday where Kristen Clark was testifying, and they were making money off of it, first of all, because people were paying to watch, and they were also not shutting down those nasty comments that people were making below. So my research since the Harper's article builds a lot on what historians like Dr. Lauer have done, showing the ways that women who are involved in white nationalism today, whether they're the vocal ones who have YouTube channels or they're quietly nurturing the culture at home, they're drawing inspiration from the women of Nazi Germany, the women of the KKK, the women of Aryan nations. They wouldn't necessarily say that. Some of them would. They have a nice way of spinning language to make things sound more palatable. And I think women in particular in this space serve a normalizing function that is extremely dangerous. So I am working on this book, which will profile 3 women, 2 of whom are still in white nationalism, one of whom has left. The one who left was significantly more generous with her time than the other 2, because she doesn't see me as the enemy. And I've learned a lot from her about some of the questions that have been asked earlier, or were asked earlier on panels, about how you leave a movement and what does it mean to extricate oneself versus changing one's psychology. And so I hope the book will be good. I feel like I'm constantly chasing the news because there's something new every day. But yeah, so I'm sort of still in the trenches, I guess. And I'm really pleased to be here today and talk with Dr. Lauer.
Thank you, Seyward. So let me ask a more general question. The Nazis promised a new society based on a social mythology, renewed nationalism, and folkish solidarity in a place of class division. Conservative symbols meant for them social unity, shared history, faith, and consciousness. And I'd like to ask both of you, do the alt-right movements in America openly identify with Nazi ideology, and what do they take from that ideology? So Wendy, would you please?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to contemplate this idea of women. Well, first of all, let's talk about their self-identification, not about the fact that these are social movements that involve men and women, and the interrelationship of the men and women are building this kind of momentum as well. So you've got the gender dynamics, right, side of it. You've got individuals in these movements who are against gender studies, right, because they just want everything to be stable, all these categories to be stable. And then you have the women who come to these movements for various reasons, and how do they self-identify? And how do they see their role? So what's their perception? So there are various ways of looking at this issue, right? And for the women who are recruitable or who go into these movements, certainly in the Nazi period, they didn't self-identify as radical. So we look at them when we think, you know, maybe they look like they're coming from the goth world or whatever. They might even visually kind of like by appearance look radical, or because they're in these movements, they're radical. but they themselves feel like they're part of a legitimate revolution. And fascism, they would say that the communists were radical and that they were a threat. So these young German women, or established German women, because they were pulling across society, from socialites down to, you know, the farmer's daughter, would say, I believe in a restoration of something. They're part of a conservative bloc that wants to draw from the past, you know, to safeguard the future. So that's why it's a little bit, you know, tricky. And there are some differences with the women you were dealing with as well, when you make these comparisons. And remember, with the women in the 1920s in Germany, they just got the vote, right, in 1919. They're not, you know, feminists in the way that we think of them, second, third wave. So if they just get the vote in 1919, and they're experiencing Weimar and then participating in the process in the 30s, they've been socialized, those voters, with what was the Kaiserreich, which was a conservative female existence of a domestic type, a traditional type. So that's something that, you know, they draw from what we would say were kind of the misogynistic tendencies or patriarchal tendencies of the Hitler movement. They related to that. There was a social logic for them. That was a comfortable sphere for them. They wanted to restore that sphere. They weren't, you know, the Rosenberg, the party ideologue, would say, you know, we're emancipating them from emancipation. So it was very conservative.
They would say very similar things today. There's a lot of the woman who I mentioned was running the live chat yesterday. Her company's slogan is "The future is the past," and it used to be dispelling the myth makers, or maybe it's the other way around now. It's dispelling the myth makers. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But the future is the past, I think, is a really neat encapsulation of what you're saying as well. This idea that sort of conservatism in a social sense is actually a radical idea. And the alt-right, such as it is, and it's a very motley designation, I think, they really see themselves as counterculture. They see themselves as hip. They see themselves as very intellectual. They're kind of like the worst person you would meet in a debate club, because like but truly, because like they think they're always a step ahead of you. Never mind that, you know, things are based on falsehoods. But they really see themselves as at the cusp of a revolution of some kind, and arguably they think it's starting because Trump is in the White House. And I think what's interesting about that versus Nazi Germany, and I was struck by this when I was reading your book for the second time before I came here, was, you know, Nazism became like a mainstream identity in Germany. It became the all-encompassing identity. And these women today, that's not the case for them. They're still existing on the fringe. So there's this kind of confluence of feeling like a revolution is necessary and that they have a vital role to play, but also feeling like they're kind of cool, like they're kind of on the edge of things. And I think that, and that also draws from, you know, how neo-Nazism in the post-war period kind of evolved. And I think today, women in the movement both draw from Nazi Germany, but then the other strains of white nationalism that came after. But I think, as you were speaking, I was thinking the future is the past, and like that is very much how they talk and how they think.
So let's talk for a minute about the status of women in the alt-right movement. We'll be also later talking about the role, what motivates women to join the ranks of the white power. But I would like to talk about the alt-right in a reference to both pre-Nazi and also Nazi era. Of course, the 1920s witnessed significant changes and also emergence of, let's call this a new woman. In a sense, Weimar culture produced a certain heady and intoxicating sense of freedom in the big cities, and especially among some intellectual and professional women. This new woman, as Wendy just mentioned, who voted, used contraception, earned wages, existed both in office, factory, bedroom and a kitchen. And this new woman eventually became a symbol of degeneracy and modern so-called asphalt culture in Nazi propaganda. So how do modern white power movements see women of today? Seyward, maybe like
Oh,
to add
sure.
this.
They don't like feminists at all. When I met with one source, I asked her to define what feminism was, and typically she, rather than answering my question, she asked me a question. And anyway, but it was clear that we had very different ideas of what feminism is. In her mind, it was women thinking they were superior to men and trying to, keep men down, essentially like a form of oppression in its own right. But what's fascinating about that in particular is there are women who are very vocal and very influential in the white nationalist space today who used to identify as feminists, and in some cases they even had their own YouTube channels about that. And something happened, and so the question becomes what? And I think that, and this is very much like a work in progress because my reporting is still ongoing, but I think a lot of women, and by a lot I mean the sample size that I'm looking at, if they have identified with feminism in the past, they in some way feel let down by it. They feel that their idea of feminism, that they would have opportunities they were promised, that if they went to college, they would get a job, that if they worked hard, they would achieve certain things. And it's a very unidimensional idea of, well, feminism allowed us access to certain things, therefore we will get certain things after that. And like there's one woman who, she had a YouTube channel for a long time where she was a book reviewer, just like an amateur book reviewer, which introduced me to the world of BookTube, which I didn't know existed, and it does. And she, went on and just reviewed books, talked about books that she loved, and who was gonna argue with that? And she had very omnivorous taste. She loved romance, she loved horror, she loved the classics, and then she got into a conflict with some other people on YouTube because she stated an opinion about diversity in book publishing, and specifically diversity of characters, so not the people publishing, but characters. And she just didn't understand why it was important. And she got, criticized, and understandably, and I think she felt really burned by it. And at the same time, I think she was living at home, she had gotten a graduate degree, she didn't have a job, and I think she felt very much like this idea of being an empowered woman wasn't working for her. And another woman who I study saw her on YouTube, contacted her, invited her on her white nationalist show, and for an hour told her how great she was and how important her viewpoint was, and how simply by virtue of being a white woman, she had value. Mm-hmm. And I think, this is a very rudimentary encapsulation of that dynamic, but I think that, there are certainly women who've always been conservative, maybe they come from a conservative religious background, and see feminism as an evil for, sort of dogmatic reasons. But then I think there are women who feel more at sea in society and culture and don't have a great grasp on what feminism actually is. And I could keep rambling about this because I find the anti-feminism intersection with white nationalism fascinating. But I think there's also an argument to be made that the popular understanding of feminism has gotten really poisoned over the last 15 years. And people have written, 15 to 20 years, people have written great books about this, about how feminism is consumerism, this idea of, it's all about wearing the t-shirts and being, empowered almost in an aesthetic sense, but there's nothing under it. There are still gains to be made, and that's the feminism that they understand, and then when things aren't working out, they look around and seek significance elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting because of some of the things we spoke about this morning concerning the anxieties and disappointments and rootlessness that certain individuals experience, and how they become vulnerable to these movements, and this more general social psychological need for validation and meaning, right? And
absolutely.
For the women in the 1920s who went back to the the model of the maternal, of the domestic Hausfrau, as it were. Well, the Nazis really bolstered that. You know, they gave value to that, and it was a way to kind of deal with the anxieties of, well, this new woman. You know, what is that? That's new. There's something exciting about it and alluring, and but modernity is bewildering. There was something also very bewildering about it. It's not, you know, black and white. And so suddenly this return to the Hausfrau, which was a very stable image and identity, and the fact that the regime was like beefing that up, suddenly they said, okay, you know, now I don't feel like my identity is in conflict with this or under siege because of this other kind of breakthrough, with, you know, post-suffragette breakthrough. So it's just some of these anxieties that are there that become settled in this way, I think is interesting.
Right, actually, Third Reich reintroduced this traditional model of family. The role of women in society was also clearly defined, and women were not really opposing that, on the contrary. And so let me ask you, do the contemporary nationalistic movements reproduce, in a sense, that model that was introduced back then in Nazi Germany? And it's so is one of the effects to push women away from decision-making positions and also leadership positions.
Well, it's interesting that this notion of power and influence that in women's history is much more complicated. We heard this morning about, well, you know, there aren't many women in the movement today, and maybe not overtly, not the face of the movement, or not kind of politically in the hierarchy as we think of formal power. But I think in studying this, you have to look at all of the places where power resides, and even softer side that actually has a pretty hard hit.
Yep.
So, for instance, in Nazi Germany, they were not in the highest ranks of there was a women's movement, and there was a female kind of figurehead for that, but they were in parliament. You know, they were pushed out of formal halls of power. And they had to confront quota systems in terms of the judiciary and educational system and so forth. And that was very misogynistic and very patriarchal and disempowering and all of that. But there's still, it's a social movement, and you know, it's half the society. So they're obviously influencing the course of events. And in the case of the revolution of Nazi Germany, which leads to the Holocaust and the genocide as we know it, they're absolutely critical to the operations and the way things occurred in the end, and the systems that were produced, that were state-sponsored, that they helped administer. So, you know, with the current situation, I think it's looking for them, as your article in Harper's just blew me away, because it was so many of the things I had studied, and I, you know, secretly hoped that they wouldn't come back, that they would materialize.
Yeah.
And not only do I see these faces from the past in the present, but they're much more complicated.
Right.
Because all the developments, you know, henceforth in terms of feminist movements and new technologies and new forms of expression and new freedoms and so forth. So it's a harder nut to crack now. It's really, really complicated. But yes, this notion of female power, I think we have to look at in different ways, is not formal ways, and the Nazis definitely capitalized on that as a social movement.
Sarah, I don't know if you would
I'm
like
definitely
to
going
add
to
anything.
strain my neck nodding while Wendy's talking. But yes, no, I think that is, and this is a theme that I'm working really hard to develop in my book, is this idea of what power means. Because when you're talking about a social movement about race and about the preservation of a race, power necessarily resides in procreation. And so women are, on the one hand, you know, pushed aside from what we would consider traditional roles of power, decision making, although not in all cases. I mean, one of the most prominent women in people in the KKK in the 20s was a woman, and she like grew the membership by leaps and bounds. And the KKK also used suffrage.
But then they kicked her out because she was too powerful.
Well, exactly. They kicked her out because she was too powerful, and also she had some deviances, but she had affairs. Anyway, women also, you know, used the vote. The women in the KKK used the vote to really advance their agenda in the 20s. So, but I think that there's this impulse to look at the misogyny of white nationalism and assume, reasonably, I guess, like, you know, well, women, why would a woman want to be around that? And I think, or want to promote that. And I think that it doesn't look deep enough into where power is located in the movement. And I also think that it assumes that a woman's gender is the thing that she's going to be most protective of. And for a white woman, maybe it's her race. And this is telling her, you know, the things that your race gives you, your privilege, your comfort. Again, they would never say privilege because they do not think they have privilege. But, you know, your safe communities, your children's futures, all these things that, because we're fundamentally a white supremacist society, have given white people. You know, maybe a woman's fine, such as it is, with sort of giving into what we would consider a more misogynistic organization or way of being, because it's protecting other things that they either long believe to be valuable or have come to believe are valuable. And I think that, like you said, it's a very tough nut to crack, especially, I mean, technology. We've obviously talked about technology a good bit today, but I mean, technology has just made this, you know, there aren't groups in the way that there used to be. There aren't compounds where they're, you know, all living out in Idaho. I mean, I guess there are still, but, you know, they're all over the place. Like, there are two very prominent white nationalist women in DC. I know one who lives in Virginia. Her neighbors like contacted me out of the blue. Never spoken to these people in my life because they read the Harper's article, and she had just moved into the neighborhood, and they were like, "What do we do?" You know, and apparently she was very nice and came over for, you know, a welcome to the neighborhood party, and you know, they were just kind of flabbergasted, like, we don't know how to handle this, and I think things like that make it a really tough nut to crack. It's not so easy to think of as an other in the way that it once was.
Can I mention one thing in terms of what's potentially significantly different in terms of the complexity of this, is this whole notion in women's studies and women's history of separate spheres. And how, with the case of women in Nazi Germany, what was kind of unusual at that point was how the politicization of society, and we know this from totalitarian regimes, right, and these theories, right, they go into the household, they go into the classroom, they start to build these youth movements, and they socialize the kids, and so whatever is private becomes political, or someone mentioned in the last panel, what is personal is political. So they're operating within the domestic realm, which is a female space, and they're pulling women out into the public sphere too. So those lines become blurred. And that's all the more case, today,
Absolutely.
especially with digital technology and the internet, where the very much of the public space is in, your den, and it's 24/7, right, on the internet.
Absolutely.
Or with homeschooling, which is in your article, which is really something we have to be very much aware of in terms of cutting off the public education system and thinking as a woman that you are going to raise your child correctly with all, basically another form of inculcation, in that setting. And then you set them out off into the world. So it's another facet of this.
Absolutely. It reminds me, I watched a YouTube video. It was like 4 women all talking from their various homes, like not in the same location. They were all, Skyping in, and you could look at the box. And they were all they're very beautiful and like very done up. And they were talking about what it means to be a woman in the movement. And one of them said, and I'm paraphrasing, but, the ideal is, cooking dinner and taking care of your kids and, running upstairs to type a fascist blog post. I mean, truly, but I think to your point, like that just blurs all kinds of lines because the public square is now on your laptop. And I think that means that arguably women have new access to more traditional types of power, in terms of being able to reach people or post these videos or run various blogs. Like I said, I feel like I'm just like running a marathon that's never going to end because every day there's something new. There's a new person, there's a new blog, there's a new something, and a lot of it has to do with the blurring of those lines.
Still trying to understand what really attracts women to this movement. We partially answered that question, but of course they have a misogynist reputation, and as you just rightly pointed out, Seyward, you wrote in your article about women being frequently accused of undermining Western civilization. There are even those who say that voting ballots should be taken away from women like Paul Ramsey, who thought women should not vote, and also he called gender equality the mother of delusion. So what really, I mean, we're talking about this, but still I'm trying to understand what can attract women to these movements.
Yeah. So I read a study recently that I've been working into my manuscript, and it was actually by a couple of researchers, sociologists, who were writing about recruitment into Islamic extremism. But they were looking at it from the perspective of, well, they essentially said there are three things involved in recruitment. This is like very much in the abstract, so not the particulars of anybody. There's a need, a narrative, and a network. And the need, everybody has needs. Like, we're all seeking things constantly. I mean, food, love. But in this case, they are interested in the need for significance, which is also a very basic human need. And what they say is essentially that need has somehow, gotten overblown to the point that it maybe overshadows other needs. So need for basic respect for your gender. And again, I'm paraphrasing and probably getting this slightly wrong, but essentially what they said is, when that need gets big enough, people go looking for it in surprising places and ways. And they find a narrative that helps them understand the need, and a network that helps them meet it or fulfill it. And that's why, on the one hand, when I tell people that some of the women I've researched used to be feminists, one of them for a while said she might be a lesbian and, was sleeping with women, and now she thinks that's totally degenerate. And another one used to be a porn actress. And another one used to be sort of like a new age singer, songwriter, who lived in like Guam for a while. Anyway, but how do they all get to this point? And it's because they are looking for something. And I think in some cases that need for significance they're finding in community. I think in some cases they're finding it in notoriety. A lot of these women have kind of like a performative need, and I think the men do too. But I found that need, narrative, network idea really compelling because it looked away from, okay, why would a woman want to be involved with a misogynistic movement, and said, maybe people make decisions that don't immediately make sense, but it's because something psychologically has gotten out of whack. And that doesn't mean that they're mentally ill at all. It just means, we all do things that are against certain interests to feed other interests. And I think this is like an extreme example of that.
I don't know if you...
I just wanted to mention it is different in the 1920s in terms of the women joining the Nazi party or getting involved in the revolution. Again, they didn't have some of these concepts at their disposal, and this is a mass movement, so the kind of almost narcissistic, performative, I want to be on the cutting edge, that isn't really as operative as social mobility, right? Because of the Nazi hierarchy, the system of respectability in that hierarchy, and women were pretty much outside the bounds of that. Putting on a uniform, being a government official, getting out of their village, because once the war started, they could, circulate around occupied Europe. Giving to a greater cause, obviously, the nation state, the restoration of the nation state. The narrative for them was becoming someone with the restoration of the nation state, with the national narrative, right? So that was like they were part of this kind of political experience. And the ways that Nazis used the propaganda, not the motherly stuff that we're going to look at in a second, but the energy of the movement, right? That was the cutting edge. That there was this momentum, this pulse, this excitement that was like the modernity of the 20s, but it was predictable. It was a little more predictable.
Right, and I think I think that's why Trump's election is quite frightening because it's frightening for a lot of reasons, but on this particular point, it's like an injection of energy into the white nationalist space. Not this one woman, I asked her, it was immediately after Trump's election, and I asked her what she thought of him, and she was like, he's not one of our guys. Like, we know that. He's pretty bad, or not bad, she wouldn't say that, but, she didn't see him as a white nationalist, but she saw him as a vehicle. And I think that, we'd been having this conversation 10, 20 years ago, which I wish people had been having more 10 or 20 years ago. I think the context would be so different because it would still very much feel at arm's length, and now it feels so much more immediate. And I think it has to do with, I don't want to say an injection of legitimacy because that's wrong. It's like an energy, a feeling that, well, maybe there is something to this, to grasp onto it. And I think that one thing women these days, to go back to something I said earlier, the idea of normalizing. I posed this question to one of my sources. If you were to, 53, 54% of white women voted for Trump or whatever the number was. And I said, what would you say to a Trump voter who clearly agrees with you on some things, but maybe would never say that she's a white nationalist or a white supremacist? And she said, oh, well, we would scare her, basically. We would say, have you ever lived in a diverse neighborhood? Do you know what that's like? Aren't you afraid for your children? What if you're raped? Which carries with it not just, the fear of sexual assault, but the fear of race mixing. And I think that they see this moment as a chance to kind of reach for those people. And then also for the conspiracy theorists and the other sort of communities, if you will, that supported Trump and see something in his presidency, and so
if time allows, hopefully we will also talk about the voting pattern then and now. But actually, I'm going to ask you, since you write about contemporary women in the white power movement, and you write about very powerful women. Actually, I'm going to ask you about the tremendous impact that they sometimes make on others. And here I'm thinking specifically about Pamela Geller, who became almost like a role model for Anders Breivik, who a few years ago murdered 69 innocent children, youth, in Norway. So how do we interpret the fact that some of these women, prominent and strong in their own right, become so idolized and by radical extremists, given the status of women in a alt-right movement?
There's an interesting study on the feminization of hatred. I don't know if you've come across that, and how female kind of representations become part of the ideology of anti-Semitism and racism. I mean, the most obvious one is, the Jewish doctor, or from the poisonous mushroom, or the Jewish man who's kind of the lecherous, threat to the purity of the woman who is going to expand the race, right? So that threat is kind of built in there. And so how some of these figures not only serve to kind of bolster the men in the movement and legitimize what they're doing, or provide some sort of moral veil, or but they also are sources. They incite the violence as well because of the protection, the machismo that goes with that, right? So that's part of some of this dynamic that's really important to be aware of.
I think that's 100% true, and I think that, I sort of think of it as there are two sides to it. There's the activist side and the symbolic side, and women very much inhabit an important symbolic space in white nationalism. And I think certainly that, comes from Nazi Germany, but, it also comes from just mainstream racism in the United States. I mean, the case of Emmett Till is like such a good example, and how many women made accusations that were false, that led to violence, and it had to do with the violation of their purity and of their sort of self as a mother of the race, or to one day be mother of the race. And I think that to your point about someone a woman who would be held up as someone who would come and speak at conferences, which they do. I think that the thing that I hear, because that is a question I definitely asked a lot, particularly when reporting the Harper's piece, they would say it's like a time of crisis kind of thing, that women need to be warriors in times of crisis. And I mean, the thing is, they always think it's a time of crisis, and so it's a convenient definition. But I think especially, and again, this goes back to the point about the energy that the Trump campaign and administration has kind of injected, is that they see it as an opportunity. I don't know, maybe crisis isn't the word that they, well, yes, they would definitely use crisis. They truly think every day is a crisis. But they see it as an opportunity, and it's kind of an all hands on deck situation. That is their way of talking about it. Of course, it's more complicated than that because they're constantly doing pirouettes around, and tumbles across, definitions of what women should and shouldn't do. But I think that they are smart enough to recognize that, at least right now, they can't reject, women who have 200, 300,000 followers on Twitter and, get banned at borders and try to push migrant boats off the shore of Italy. Actually happened. If women are doing that, they don't want to say no to that just because they're women. And so they're, I think, in real time kind of redefining what they're okay with in a time of opportunity or crisis.
So actually, from what we hear, it appears that women are very powerful, and yet there is very little we know about that we can read about this, that has been written about this issue. And Wendy, I'd like to ask you specifically about the role of women in Nazi Germany. In your brilliant book, Hitler and Furious, you actually talk about the very important role that women play that is often ignored. There's Professor Goldenberg with us in the audience today, who in a sense paved the way to Holocaust and women studies, but still there is so little that has been written on this issue, and we know from your book that women played a significant role in the Holocaust, including acting killing as nurses, clerics, or just spouses of Nazi officials. So how can this be explained? Why there's so little that we know, that we teach, that we write about the role of women facilitating the Holocaust?
There's many facets, ways to answer that question. First of all, the boundary pushing is very important when you have times of perceived crisis or revolution, this flux, how far can, we talked about that earlier today, that seemed bewildering to those from the outside, and during the Holocaust were certainly mind-boggling to the Jewish victims who expected certain reactions from women, nurturing, protective, potential rescuers, and were just dumbfounded when they received the opposite kind of treatment from the German women, who were empowered as a race, as the Aryan race. So, in the case of the Holocaust, the roles are so varied, and they remained to a large extent kind of invisible in the historiography because of all the bias that we bring to the history, right? In terms of not thinking that women are powerful. We got a little taste of that this morning. They said, well, they're not really in the movement, even though it's considered a growing mass movement. So that kind of bias, and then the fact that it's hard to uncover this because it takes place in all these different kind of forms that are public and private. There's no one archive for this. You have to look in memoirs, you have to interview people. So doing women's history in general is a little bit more challenging in terms of source base and the way you collect it and the sleuthing that you do in piecing files together and so forth. So, but they're there once you're looking for them, right? They're in the files, the personnel records, the lists of nurses, so they're in those, typically in those female professional or maternal kind of private roles. Then you have to put the question to that, well, to what extent in a genocidal society are those traditional roles perverted? Like, how did they play out in that context? And that's where you start to see domestic tools being put to bear, being applied to these kinds of criminal operations that look normal, right? They're otherwise hard to detect. So in my one case, I just throw, for example, two cases, kind of examples of some of the worst killers. So you have a woman in Drohobych, Ukraine. Her husband's the Gestapo chief, so she's there as the mate, right? She wouldn't otherwise be visible in the documentation other than being his wife, SS wife. And she's walking down the street, and there are Jewish laborers in Drohobych doing grunt work, on the street. And she's got her baby in the baby carriage, and she's ramming her baby carriage into them, and using the baby carriage, right? Or they're working in the garden in the house, and she has a parlor rifle and takes pot shots at them, and they're within her garden, or one of the worst cases of a woman who's also the wife of an SS officer, the Jewish children who have fled from the boxcar going to Sobibor, right? And they think that they can find refuge with her in this house, this big manor. And she brings them into the kitchen and feeds them and even gives them that impression. But then she actually takes them to the edge of the estate and shoots them in the back of the neck, 6 little boys. So, those are things that happen, and they didn't happen in a large-scale fashion, to this extent that these order policemen were gunning down, or Einsatzgruppen were gunning down victims in Ukraine and so forth. But nonetheless, all of this is happening together, and that's what amounts to a Holocaust, is these kinds of operations that bleed over into all these spheres and the mobilization of society as a whole. And we have to, I think, having this conversation is a way of building up our sensitivity to kind of building up what we think of might be the dashboard of possibilities, right? And unless you kind of open your mind to that, and the gendered elements of that in this case, and men and women's roles, it's that much harder to anticipate where things might lead, and how violent things can become if we're not aware of these possibilities.
Absolutely. I think, when I'm constantly reading other people's research because I'm not really an expert in anything. I'm an observer. I'm a journalist. And I was reading about the Women Are Wonderful effect. And this, sort of idea that people, I think it was coined in like 1994 as an academic concept, that people are just more likely to think that women are good. They're likely to think that they're nurturing. They're likely to think that they
are innocent.
Are going to, they're going to care. They're going to answer to their better angels. And that effect is interesting to me on a lot of different levels. But the two that I think apply to white nationalism are that they use that to their advantage. Because they know that people are going to give them the benefit of the doubt before they're going to give it to a guy tattooed with swastikas. And they know that, and one of my sources said this at a conference that she spoke at. She said, women can get away with saying hard things because we're soft. I'm paraphrasing again, but that's essentially what she said. And I think that is really important, because not that they would call it the Women Are Wonderful effect, but they recognize the human and social tendency to think of women as better somehow. And I think that the other level of that's really interesting is I think that exact same thing is what motivates people to think that women aren't involved.
It's very interesting what you're saying, because we often, we cannot really imagine a woman committing a crime, which is not necessarily true. Then there's this picture that we all create, and it's probably not that women cannot really commit a crime, but this is we just cannot go beyond a certain way we think about women and their role in a society. So let me ask you: do you think the inversion of gender roles during World War I and the following years, and also changing political situations, in a sense, compelled women to join the ranks of the Nazi Party and eventually become perpetrators? We rarely use that term with a reference to women and the Holocaust. And before I ask you to answer that question, I want to kindly remind you that in a couple of minutes we'll be collecting your questions. So you can find note cards either under your seat or on your seat. So.
So we did talk about these different perversions of roles that are traditionally female. So, the nurses and their involvement. I could just mention, the euthanasia program and the mass murder of almost 250,000 mentally and physically disabled. Using the needle, injection needle, so forth, or working as secretaries and making sure that the orders and the trains ran on time, and kind of in the machinery of destruction, as the mates of some of the mass murderers, and kind of bolstering their egos and creating those sanctuaries for them, and then also participating in the violence themselves, as consumers of plunder. Earlier today, Father Dubois said, it's not hate alone, it's also sex and greed, and so the materiality of all this is really important as mass consumers, so that's important. But at the time, in the 20s in particular, there was a very heated debate with the loss of the population in the First World War over nations and their natalistic policies and birth rates and the size of the population being the strength of the nation, right, which is part of what they're arguing today. And so, of course, women suddenly had this power because they were the producers, right, and we talked about this, and the source of life for that movement. And so as much as they were empowered by that, for those who were considered pollutants to the race, you know, they could flip that. It was like almost like a split personality from being the nurturer, the provider, everything we think of as feminine, and then they could be completely kind of anti-maternalistic, you know, vis-a-vis Jews and vis-a-vis the mentally and physically disabled and so-called, you know, other enemies of the Reich. So those could coexist, not only in women, but also in men. So while they're the life force as the family nurturers, they're also engaged in what is the destruction of the family. I just want to mention this because the family unit is so core to this movement. The genealogy, the fact that genocide is ultimately about, you know, root and branch destruction of the life force of another community, and all the different forms that that can take, and how women are part of that. So the border business right now, you know, how is it that or mass incarceration, how do you destroy communities and life forces in communities, both cultural symbolic spaces like churches, but also the unity of the family? So when you look at, like, if you could put up this picture, the promotion of the family, you know, you have to realize that there's the kind of the dark side of that, which is whoever is defined as the enemy, that life force has to be destroyed, right? Sterilization, mass sterilization. This is the alternative for Germany party, the third largest party in Germany. So this is Frauke Petry, who's one of the leaders. She's very controversial. We won't go into her biography, but this is a promotion of the party, saying, you know, give your trust in Germany, your vow to Germany, and look, she's holding the baby, the infant. She's got the wedding ring on, right? So this is your role, and it's white. It's very white, the background, the image, right? And then go to the Nazi image, and you can just see, you know, the kind of resonance of this in terms of a political culture and an appeal. I just wanted to point that out.
I'm glad we have 2 more hours for this session, because I just received many questions, so I will try to go over them. And but let's switch back for a minute to modern times. Actually, you already showed this very interesting picture in, I think particularly in Europe, we see the emergence of nationalistic movements and nationalistic and also neo-Nazi movements. Well, so let me ask you, do you think that this motivates what we see now, women to become more involved in political matters, both as supporters and opponents?
Sorry. So you're saying
The activism on both sides.
the activism on both sides? I mean, yes, I think, but I think this kind of gets back to the question of, you know, what is power? I think also what is activism? And I think that, you know, women in the white nationalist movement would think of having a baby as an act of political, like, will, and as a political act. And I think, you know, certainly on the other side, I think that it's motivating. It motivated me, but to know more. But I think, I don't know, one of the things I'm really fascinated in is this redefining of what activism is, because I think particularly in a social movement context, you know, we think of it as, I don't know, something that, you know, involves some sort of transaction or, you know, pressing a voting button or whatever. Or, and I think that it's way more complicated today. I mean, it was always complicated, but I think it's increasingly complicated. So, sorry, I feel like that was not a great answer to your question.
I'm sorry, focusing a little bit.
No,
on
it's
your
totally
question,
fine. It was
so-
a bad answer. Go on.
Okay.
No,
Well,
not at all. Not at all, because you're just stringing out what's traditional thought of as activism, which could be picketing, or you know,
Right.
what forms is it taking, and it's much more varied.
Right.
And it could be, you know, there's symbolic forms. There's you know, direct participation.
Right.
There's consumption patterns. I mean, it's
Right.
it's very complex. Expression on YouTube.
Right.
You know, and forms of persuasion that take on all these different forms.
Right. I will give a concrete answer or example is the tradwife phenomenon, if people are familiar with hashtag tradwife. So basically, it's this you know, idea of going back to a very traditional concept of what it means to be a wife and a mother, but it also embraces the aesthetics of it. And so it's like, you know, that ideal for the digital age. And so, you know, snapping selfies, wearing your hair in like a 1940s updo, and, you know, showing sort of like those old advertisements of, you know, women with the vacuums and, you know, basically recreating those images. And on its surface, it seems deeply aesthetic and, you know, fine, whatever, but it's connected to this idea of the family unit as, you know, vital to the nation, as women having a particular role. And I don't know that you necessarily, before a few years ago, thought of Instagramming as a political act, but in a way it is, because, you know, they're creating an online movement, and they're appealing to women who have, you know, no immediate interest in race, but they're saying, oh, you're a stay-at-home mom, and like you want to be valued for that, like follow our hashtag, and it's a slippery slope.
So actually, there's a question that comes from the audience that partially relates to what you just said. And here it comes. What do you think is the most effective way to make feminism appeal to conservative women who may not be attracted to it at the moment? Is there a place for the female Trump voter in contemporary feminism, or is it the Trump movement authentical to feminism?
Or antithetical.
Oh,
yeah.
antithetical, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
Yeah,
so
that's
let's
a tough
move on
question.
and
That's
get
a tough
another
nut.
question.
We haven't really talked about parts of, like, how to tease out what we think of as appealing, you know, to a woman, right? That might, how we could open up another pathway, right? One thing we haven't talked about at all, which was very much a part of the Nazi women's kind of identity, or how the propaganda pitched it, was the church. And I'm trying to figure out, you know, where the church fits into all of this, and that space, and the kinds of possibilities of discourse that can come out of religious teachings and instruction. I see a lot of hypocrisy, and I'm just wondering if that can in any way be as another institution. If you've had discussions with some of the women you've interacted with, because the church was actually very important for the Christian movement and the Nazi movement. Yeah.
Some of them are very Christian, and one of the women I have been focusing on converted to Mormonism. Others have more historically, because this movement is not quite as powerful as it once was, but the Christian identity movement from the 80s, 90s, and early aughts, you know, they kind of come from that hyper-religious world. But then one of the women I focus on, like, honestly never mentioned religion, like, at any point in time. Just, she was a neo-Nazi. She, you know, ran the chapter of her National Socialist movement chapter in her city, and just religion's just like not even a thing she thinks about. And then there's another woman who's actually very anti-Christian. She's anti all Abrahamic religions. She's neo-pagan, which is a whole other side of this world that we could get into, and that women were very influential in shaping. But you know, it's tricky because there's so little data on, you know, well, who are these people? Where are they? How do they identify? You know, certainly I think churches could be an avenue for recruitment, but also on the flip side, sort of, you know, using them as vessels to say, like, this is not a good way of thinking about your faith. But it's hard because that leaves huge swaths of people. And I think, you know, the United States is becoming decreasingly religious. and
in a corporate way.
Yeah, exactly. And so like people are still religious and they want to believe in something, but they're going to YouTube to find it. So
mega churches that feel like rallies.
Yeah.
So actually somebody asked, are there ties or notable connections between white supremacy and the anti-abortion movement? Does white supremacy require that a woman give up the idea of choice in favor of preserving the movement or the race as a whole?
Yes. Actually, a very prominent anti-abortion activist like got outed as a white nationalist. She lives in Texas. Her name is Kristen Hatton. She and this other woman, Destiny Herndon De La Rosa, run something called, I think it's New Wave Feminists, and they made a little bit of news around the time of the Women's March because they're an anti-choice group, but call themselves feminists, and they were originally invited to participate in the Women's March and then uninvited. And over the course of the next year, Kristen, it turned out, was keeping a blog, I forget what the name of it was, in which she was very much a white nationalist. Destiny was not. I've spoken at length with Destiny about this, and she is still sort of baffled by the whole thing that her friend and sort of business partner or activist partner wound up in this direction. But the trad life world, trad wife world is typically very pro-life and for white people. And so that's definitely like a potential recruiting ground, are women who exist in that space.
I don't even know if there's any way to make it clear what the implications of all of this would be for an individual in terms of giving yourself over to this greater cause in terms of your value being strictly biological, the autonomy that you forfeit, the freedom, ultimately the freedom that you lose. I just wonder to what extent, because of the Nazi dictatorship and knowing that history and ultimately not only freedom but potentially your life, because if you're suddenly deemed, racially inferior or there's something wrong with you genetically, that it's over, right? So it all kind of maybe sounds good in terms of what they're doing. They're operating in a way that is demonstrating a lot of freedom of movement, of expression, of getting on YouTube and enjoying that freedom, and not maybe thinking through that what they're promoting,
right.
of course, right? But I just don't know if it's possible even to have that kind of a conversation.
Well, it reminds me of people who watch The Handmaid's Tale, which debuted at exactly the time I was writing the first draft of my Harper's article, and it was a terrible choice to watch it because it's a great show and so timely in a weird dystopic way. But the character of Sabrina Joy, is that her name? So Serena Joy, the wife of the guy who regularly rapes Elizabeth Moss. She is this, perfect housewife, perfect cog in the machine of this state that's been set up. And then they start getting into the flashbacks, and I don't want to give too much away, but they start getting into the flashbacks.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert. Not really. Basically, they start showing you how this new society got built, and you realize that she was actually a crucial spokesperson. Went to college campuses. Was the sort of person who led rallies. People really found her inspiring. And then an important storyline as the show goes on is her sort of coming to terms with the fact that, well, now that we've reached the fruition of this state, where do I fit in? And there's a scene where she's, the door closes, kind of like the end of The Godfather, where Diane Keaton can't come into the room, the door closes and she can't go into a meeting that once she thought maybe she would have been invited into because she was smart and, she was a part of things. So I think to your point, when you ask that question about the long term, well, what would happen if you created an ethno-state in Montana and Idaho and Oregon and Washington? How would this work? How would this work? And they're details, And I think, and I'm being glib and I shouldn't, but I honestly, maybe you feel this way when you work in this space, you kind of have to find some humor. But really, they just kind of kick the can. And I think for women, especially, they're getting something out of it right now. And we're all immediate beings, kind of goes back to the point about making choices that aren't necessarily in our long-term interest. And so they're not thinking through, or they're imagining it in an idealized way, that it would be the great halcyon vision that they currently have, whereas it would not. Sorry.
Another question. We have so many great questions, and I think we have time for another one or two. You're the first panel to use the term fascism and highlight some key features of it. Do you think it would be useful to bring this term into discussion about the modern far right? Is there ideological continuity versus with interwar fascism?
Yes. Yes to all of the above. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this, the anti-liberal, the use of culture, the use of the mass mobilization, the nationalism, the anti-Semitism. So I mean, it just, it's really the parallels are really striking. Again, as I mentioned this morning, it's the crisis, anti-globalization, right, anti-internationalism. I'm perplexed because I'm trying to figure out historically, why now? Why now? What happened in the last, we have September 11th. I'm thinking also about the international organizations. The first UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was 1993, the collapse of the Soviet Union, identity politics, activism, the recession 2009. I'm trying to figure out what happened from 1975 until now that we find ourselves in this moment. It doesn't seem to me to be as a real crisis in terms of the economy and
this is like virus, right?
Yeah.
It's not
so I just don't understand
what the
precipitate. I mean, it's also, as an historian, well, we've got the contingency of history. We've got Trump in the White House. We've got things that are there historically and kind of simmering and under the wire, and suddenly you have someone put in a position of power, who's then and then mimicry across and other like figures. In Poland and Hungary, and so they've been kind of gaining traction and so forth. But I'm still just trying to think this through. I have to.
That's a question for another conference. So let me conclude with one more question. Could you both please speak more about the role of women in normalizing these movements? What are examples?
Sure. So normalizing. If we think of normal in the sense of sort of mundane, like family life, hanging out with friends, the person next door, they serve a really important function in promoting the idea that they are in that space. So, I mean, a lot of organizations today, and this actually started a while ago. I think it's just kind of coming to light and certainly blossoming now. Organizations are very anti-tattoos and anti, you should look like you're on a debate team, you should dress nicely, you should seem no different than the person next to you. It's kind of like counterculture in disguise, or like a Trojan horse kind of thing. And I think women play a really important role in that because of our social ideas about what family is and what friendship is and what femininity is. And so, I mean, the trad life phenomenon is sort of in that vein of saying, we're just, and this is happening to I wish somebody much smarter than I did had a grand theory about why now. But I think that, the trad life phenomenon is happening at a really fascinating moment because women are really seeking culturally to reclaim motherhood, their agency over it, and the idea that it is something of value, and fighting for the right to take substantial time off work and still get paid, and all these different things. And so they're pulling at something there that is part of the mainstream discourse, and I think that. Men certainly perform normalizing functions as well, but women seem nice. They seem like they could be your sister or your mom or your girlfriend at school or whatever. And I mean, they say this, they actively say this. If you watch their dedicated channels on social media, they say women can do this better than men. they can seem more normal in a way. And maybe it's just a bad word, normal. What is normal? But yeah, I don't know, they play a really important role there.
Well, thank you very much, Seyward. And before I thank our speakers, I hope that everybody can join us for the next panel, which will start at 3:40. And the title of this discussion is "The Democratic Prospect: Thinking about America's Democracy in Light of Populist Movements."
And I don't know who asked that question about feminism and Trump voters. I would love to talk about it when the mic's not on.
Well, and at least you can join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. Thank you.